Before we begin, tap subscribe and leave a comment with your city and age. Your voice helps stories like this be heard. The music was deafening, the kind that rattles the chest and makes the glasses tremble on the tables. Balloons floated against the ceiling, silver and gold, with a banner that read "Congratulations" stretched across the wall. Laughter spilled from every corner, mixed with the clinking of champagne flutes and the sugary smell of the cake that stood untouched in the center of the room. And there he was, my husband, his hand proudly resting on the small curve of another woman's belly, his smile wide, radiant, and poisonous. They were celebrating life, a child that was supposed to symbolize love and future, and yet all I felt was the slow crushing of my chest. Every beat of the music, every cheer from his family, was a hammer striking the coffin of the life I thought I had. For years I had sacrificed everything. Since 2012, I had been working double shifts at the clinic, saving every dollar, sending part of my salary to help his parents keep their home, paying for his younger sister's college books when no one else stepped up. I believed in family, in loyalty, in the quiet strength of building a future together. My fingers still remember the sting of scrubbing floors late at night after 12 hours of nursing, the smell of antiseptic clinging to my skin, the ache of swollen ankles. I thought it was all worth it because we were building something together. But standing in that room, surrounded by people clapping for their perfect little announcement, I realized I had been financing my own humiliation. The lights shimmered against crystal glasses as his mistress, yes, mistress, though they called her the guest of honor, beamed at him, her cheeks flushed with happiness. She was younger, softer, untouched by the weight of bills and responsibilities. I could hear someone whisper, "He deserves this. Finally a real family of his own." The words stabbed deeper than any knife. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted iron because my instinct was to scream. Scream about the lies. The nights he told me he was working late. The mornings he came home with perfume not mine clinging to his shirt. The money I found missing from our account, only to learn later he had been buying gifts for her. But worse than all of it was the knowledge that the man everyone was cheering for was not even the father of that unborn child. I knew the truth. The truth was a storm inside me, violent and uncontrollable, pressing against my ribs until I could barely breathe. I had the proof, and I carried it like a loaded gun in my purse. The results from the test, the conversations I had uncovered, the late-night calls that confirmed everything. He was celebrating another man's child, as if it were his legacy. The humiliation was not mine to carry alone. It belonged to him. I stood at the edge of the room, watching him raise his glass, his voice echoing with pride. To the future, to our child, to love. The crowd erupted, clapping and cheering. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from rage that had been simmering for months. Years of sacrifice had led to this stage, this performance, this grotesque theater of betrayal. I walked forward slowly, each step cutting through the noise until a few faces began to turn toward me, curiosity replacing joy. My heels clicked against the polished floor like a drumbeat of war, and the silence spread from one corner to another, until only the music dared to continue. He saw me then. His smile faltered just for a second, but I caught it. The panic in his eyes, the slight tightening of his jaw. He knew. Deep down he knew the fortress of lies he had built was about to collapse. My chest rose and fell as I reached the center of the room. I could feel every gaze burning against my skin, the heat of the lights above, the suffocating sweetness of flowers on the table. I opened my purse slowly, deliberately, and pulled out the envelope. My voice, though trembling at first, grew stronger with each word. "You should know the truth before you all celebrate a lie." The mistress clutched her belly protectively, her eyes darting between me and him. He tried to laugh, to dismiss me. "She's upset. Don't listen." But the sound of my voice cut sharper than glass. I held up the papers, the evidence that shattered the illusion. This child is not his. The silence that followed was heavier than the loudest explosion. Glasses froze midair, mouths parted, but no words came out. And then, as if the walls themselves could no longer contain it, the room erupted. Not in applause this time, but in whispers, gasps, and stares that sliced him open more brutally than I ever could. At that moment, I wasn't just a woman betrayed, I was the executioner of his carefully crafted lie. The years of sacrifice, the loneliness, the manipulation, the endless justifications I made for his absences, all of it crystallized into that one act of revelation. And as his face turned pale, his shoulders slumped, and the mistress's smile crumbled into horror, I felt the strangest mix of grief and liberation. Grief for the years lost, but liberation for finally tearing off the mask he wore so proudly. The music still played, absurdly cheerful, but the party was over. For him, for her, for us. And as I stood there, with the shattered remains of our life scattered across the room, I knew this was only the beginning of a story that would unravel in ways none of us could predict. The sound of the whispers still echoes in my ears, long after the room had descended into chaos. People moved awkwardly, their once joyful chatter replaced by nervous murmurs and sidelong glances. Some avoided my eyes, afraid of being caught staring, while others leaned closer to each other, their voices sharp and hushed as they dissected every detail of what I had just revealed. My husband, no, the man who had betrayed me, stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, his hand slipping from the woman's belly as though the weight of the truth had broken him in half. I almost pitied him in that moment, almost, but the years of sacrifice I had endured burned hotter than any fragile sympathy. I remembered all too clearly the years I spent bending my back and breaking my spirit for him. It wasn't just money. It was time. It was youth. It was the simple dreams I had set aside so his could thrive. Back in 2015, when we struggled to pay rent, it was me who picked up extra night shifts at the hospital, who walked home in the cold at 3 a.m., because we couldn't afford gas for both cars. I told myself then that it was temporary, that it was what love demanded, what marriage required. And every time I slipped my sore feet into icy water to numb the ache before sleeping a few hours, I told myself I was investing in our future. But standing there, watching his face drain of color, I saw that all my sacrifices had been nothing more than fuel for his lies. The woman beside him, her, the mistress who now stood trembling, looked at me as if I had shattered her entire world. She pressed her lips together, one hand still on her stomach, the other gripping the back of a chair for balance. I wondered then if she knew, if he had told her the truth, or if she too had been manipulated, lulled into a fantasy by his charming words. The anger in my chest softened for a moment as I saw her confusion, but then I remembered the jewelry she wore, the expensive bracelet I recognized as the one missing from our safe, the one he told me he had pawned to pay for bills. She wasn't innocent. She was complicit in my suffering, dancing on the ruins of my life while smiling into his lies. I stepped closer, my heels pressing into the polished wood, and the crowd parted like water around me. His voice finally cracked through the tension. "Please, let's talk about this privately." The audacity of his request nearly made me laugh. Privately? After he had humiliated me in front of the world? After he turned my years of loyalty into a stage for his performance? No. This deserved to be seen. The masks had to fall under the same lights that had celebrated their shameless announcement. I could feel my heart pounding, but instead of fear, it was power that coursed through me. Power born from truth. I looked at his parents, the ones I had supported for years, the ones who called me their daughter when they needed money, but who now looked at me as though I were the problem. Their stares were cold, judgmental, already rewriting the story in their minds to paint me as bitter, jealous, vengeful. I wanted to scream at them, to remind them of the $500 I sent every month, the groceries I carried into their home, the countless times I put their needs above my own. But I realized in that moment it would not matter. They were as blind to his lies as I had been. The room began to thin out as some guests quietly slipped away, unwilling to be part of the wreckage. I watched a couple whisper to each other before leaving their half-full glasses behind. The celebration had dissolved, and all that was left was the bitter taste of exposed deceit. My husband tried again, his voice strained. "You don't understand. This isn't what it looks like. I tilted my head, almost amused at his choice of words. How many times had he used that line on me over the years? When I found unexplained charges on the credit card, when I smelled perfume that wasn't mine, when I woke up alone to find his side of the bed cold. This isn't what it looks like. But now, in this room filled with witnesses, there was no curtain left to hide behind. Everyone could see exactly what it was. A lie dressed in balloons and cake. A betrayal masked as celebration. A hollow man holding a future that wasn't his. My voice came out steady, stronger than I felt. I gave you everything. My time, my money, my loyalty. And this is how you repay me? By parading around with someone else and claiming a child that isn't even yours? My words cut through the silence, and though I didn't shout, the weight of them struck harder than any scream could have. He flinched, his eyes darting around the room as though searching for an exit, for someone to defend him. But no one moved. No one came to his rescue. And in that suffocating silence, I realized something I hadn't before. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about the mistress or the family that turned a blind eye. This was about me, about reclaiming the years I had lost, the identity I had buried beneath the role of dutiful wife and selfless provider. It was about finally speaking my truth, no matter how raw or messy, and forcing him to confront the ruins he had created. As I looked at his pale face, at the tears starting to well in the mistress's eyes, I felt the air shift. This was no longer a party. It was a reckoning. And though my heart still ached, though the betrayal still burned, I knew I had taken the first step toward freeing myself from the prison of his lies. The night was far from over, and the fallout had only just begun. The fallout began the moment I lowered the papers back into my purse. It was as if the silence itself snapped under the weight of what had just been revealed. The murmurs grew louder, no longer whispers but full conversations, some angry, some mocking, others incredulous. I caught fragments. All those years. How could he? Poor woman. But they swirled together into a storm that pressed against my temples. My husband stood rooted to the spot, his face pale, his hands twitching as if he wanted to grab mine, to pull me aside, to plead. Yet he didn't move. Perhaps he finally understood that there was no curtain thick enough to hide behind, no story convincing enough to erase the truth. As I looked at him, flashes of the years we had spent together raced through my mind like cruel reminders of everything I had lost. 2013, when we could barely afford a mattress and I saved tips from double shifts at the diner to buy one. 2016, when he promised that once his business took off, I wouldn't have to work such long hours anymore. 2019, when he swore his late nights were for us, for the future he was building. Every memory was painted with sacrifice. But now, in the glaring light of betrayal, all I could see was how those sacrifices had been wasted. He had never been building a future with me. He had been building a stage for his deceit. His mistress shifted uncomfortably under the eyes of the guests, her hand trembling against her stomach. She tried to speak, her voice soft, almost pleading. This isn't fair. But the words dissolved into the thick air. Not fair. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity. Fair had never been part of the equation for me. It wasn't fair when I paid off his debts while he smiled and spent money behind my back. It wasn't fair when I put my dreams on hold so he could chase his without worry. And it certainly wasn't fair when he looked me in the eyes and swore he was faithful, while his hands were already tangled in another woman's life. Fairness had abandoned me long ago. I remember my mother's voice echoing in my head then, her warnings from years ago. Be careful with him. He's charming, but charm doesn't pay the bills, and it doesn't build a marriage. I dismissed her, too blinded by love, too desperate to prove I was right. Now I stood there, her words replaying with brutal clarity, and I wondered how many red flags I had ignored, the lies I had chosen not to see, the nights I swallowed my suspicions to keep the peace, the times I convinced myself that loyalty was stronger than truth. My stomach twisted as the weight of my own denial pressed against me. And then he spoke, finally gathering enough strength to step toward me. Please, stop this, he begged, his voice breaking. "We can fix it. We can talk. Don't ruin everything." His words hung in the air, and for a fleeting second, I almost felt the familiar pull of his manipulation. The soft tone, the desperate eyes, the illusion of vulnerability. He had used that same tone countless times before, when I confronted him about money missing, when I asked about the perfume, when I dared to question his late nights. Don't ruin everything, as if I were the one wielding the knife that cut us apart, as if my truth was more destructive than his years of betrayal. I stared at him, my throat tightening with the weight of words I had carried for too long. "Everything is already ruined," I whispered, but even I could feel the power behind the quietness of my voice. His face twisted, desperate, searching the crowd for support. But none came. No one lifted a hand to shield him. No one defended his honor. They just stared, some with pity, some with disgust, all of them witnessing the collapse of the man he pretended to be. I turned my eyes back to the mistress, her lips trembling, tears brimming in her eyes. She clutched her stomach as if the truth itself was something physical that could harm her child. I wanted to tell her I didn't hate her, that my fury belonged to him, not her. But then I saw her bracelet again, the one that had once been mine, and my compassion froze. She hadn't just stolen his affection. She had worn the jewels of my sacrifice as trophies. The weight of the years, the exhaustion of silence, the humiliation of this night, all of it pressed against me until I could barely stand. But I would not crumble here, not in front of him, not in front of the family that had taken without gratitude. If anything, this was my chance to stand taller than I ever had before, to make it clear that I was not the victim of his story. I was the one who had survived it. As I looked at the shattered man in front of me, I realized the party had been transformed into something else entirely. It was no longer his celebration. It was my liberation. And though the night stretched on, heavy with tension and eyes that followed my every move, I knew I was walking out of that room with something far greater than revenge. I was walking out with my voice, reclaimed after years of being silenced. And as the door closed behind me, the sound of muffled arguments fading into the night, I felt the cold air hit my face. It was sharp, almost painful, but it was real. For the first time in years, the air I breathed wasn't filled with his lies. The cold air outside wrapped around me like a punishment and a blessing at the same time. It stung my cheeks, reddened my skin, but it also cleared the suffocating perfume of betrayal that had filled that room. For a moment, I stood there on the sidewalk, my breath forming pale clouds under the streetlights, listening to the muffled chaos leaking from behind the doors. I could hear raised voices, his, desperate and defensive, hers, broken and fragile, the crowd buzzing like bees after their hive had been smashed open. But I no longer belonged to that hive. I was done. Or at least I thought I was. As I walked away, my heels clicking against the cracked pavement, memories clawed their way back to me. Nights of silent dinners where I convinced myself his absence was just exhaustion. The countless times I found receipts in his pockets. Luxury restaurants I had never been taken to. Jewelry I never received. I remembered 2018 with brutal clarity, the year I took out a loan in my name to cover his failed investment. He had promised me that by Christmas we would be debt-free, that the sacrifice would be temporary. Instead, I spent New Year's Eve crying quietly in the bathroom, while he laughed on the phone with someone I now know wasn't a business partner. Each step forward on that empty street felt like a step back through my own history of denial. How many times had I carried him when he should have been carrying me? How many dreams of mine had been postponed so his lies could thrive? I had once wanted to open my own small practice, to save enough to travel, to see Rome, to walk through the narrow streets of Florence like my grandmother once did. Instead, I poured everything into him. I worked myself into exhaustion, sent money to his parents, fed the endless hunger of his family's needs while mine were left starving. And still, I told myself it was love. The anger inside me swirled with grief, a storm that didn't know which way to turn. I reached the corner and stopped, the glow of the street lamp above flickering, as if even the world around me struggled to stay steady. My phone buzzed in my purse. His name lit up the screen. For a long moment, I just stared at it, the letters of his name blurring through my tears. How many times had I picked up his calls in the past, rushing to soothe, to explain, to forgive? My thumb hovered over the green button, but then something inside me snapped. I let it ring until it died. The silence after was deafening, but it felt like a victory. I walked on, past shuttered shops and quiet houses where families gathered around televisions, unaware of the war I had just fought. My legs ached, but I didn't stop. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't go back. Not to that house filled with his lies. Not to the bed that had become a grave for my trust. The thought of lying there again, next to him, knowing where he had been, what he had done, made my stomach twist violently. Eventually, I found myself standing in front of the small park where we used to go when we first met. I could see the bench where he once promised me the world, where he swore he would protect me from everything. I sat down, my body trembling from cold and exhaustion, and stared at the empty swings swaying gently in the wind. It was here, years ago, that I had believed in him the most, and it was here, now, that I finally began to let him go. The tears came then, not as a quiet drizzle but as a flood I could no longer hold back. They blurred the lights, turned the world into streaks of gold and white, and I buried my face in my hands. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the years I would never get back, the dreams I had smothered, the person I had lost inside the role of being his wife. I cried for the woman who had believed too deeply, who had given too much, who had silenced her doubts because love was supposed to be patient, forgiving, enduring. I cried for myself, and when the tears finally subsided, when the shivers coursing through my body calmed, a strange calmness crept in. I realized that leaving that party wasn't just walking away from him, it was walking back to myself. I had spent over a decade chained to his needs, his manipulations, his constant taking. Now, in the stillness of the night, surrounded by the echo of my own sobs, I felt the first fragile taste of freedom. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. I didn't know how I would face the financial mess, the tangled lies, the shame his betrayal had smeared across my name. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was no longer trapped in his script. The story had shifted, and though it terrified me, it also filled me with a quiet, simmering strength. When my phone buzzed again, I didn't even look. I stood, wiped my face with my trembling hands, and walked into the night. Somewhere inside me, I knew this was not the end. This was the beginning of something I had been too afraid to claim for far too long. The night swallowed me whole as I walked, my breath forming pale clouds against the biting air. I didn't know where my feet were taking me, only that they refused to turn back toward the house I no longer recognized as my own. Each step was heavier than the last, as if the weight of all those years of sacrifice clung to my ankles, begging me not to forget. Streetlights buzzed overhead, their pale glow revealing fragments of my reflection in every shop window I passed. My face swollen from crying, my mascara smeared, my shoulders hunched with exhaustion. I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. By the time I reached the bus stop, my legs trembled with fatigue. The bench was cold, the metal biting through my coat as I sat, clutching my purse like it was the last piece of armor I had left. Around me, the city moved on, indifferent to my collapse. Cars hummed by, their headlights slicing through the dark. Strangers laughed as they passed, unaware that my world had just imploded. I stared down at my phone again, his name flashing across the screen, insistent, relentless. He was calling over and over, and though my hands shook, I refused to answer. Each ignored call was a small act of defiance, a reminder that for once I wasn't bending to his will. As the night stretched on, memories crashed into me with merciless precision. I thought of 2017, when we moved into that small house together. He had promised it would be the first step, that soon we would have something bigger, something better. I painted the walls myself, scrubbing my hands raw to make it feel like home. He never noticed the details, The way I stayed up until dawn to finish the kitchen before his birthday. The meals I skipped to buy curtains that matched the furniture. He only saw what he lacked, what he wanted next. And I kept giving until there was nothing left to give. And now here I was, sitting at a bus stop with nowhere to go, realizing that every sacrifice had been fuel for a lie. The humiliation of that party replayed in my head on a loop. His hand on her belly, his proud smile, the whispers of the guests when I revealed the truth. I could still hear the gasp that rippled through the room, still feel the sting of all those eyes turning on me. I should have felt triumphant for exposing him, but instead I felt hollow. Revenge had not healed me. It had only cracked open the wounds I had been covering for years. The bus arrived with a hiss of brakes, and I climbed aboard, paying with the few crumpled bills I had in my wallet. I sat near the back, staring out the window as the city blurred past. Neon lights smeared into streaks of red and blue, and my reflection stared back at me through the glass. A stranger's face. A woman who had given everything and been left with nothing. As the bus rattled down the avenue, I thought about his parents. How many times had I slipped envelopes of cash into their hands, assuring them it was no trouble? How many times had they called me their daughter, only to look at me tonight like I was the enemy? I had been blind to their silence, their willingness to take what I offered without ever questioning where it came from. Maybe they had always known. Maybe they had chosen not to see, just as I had. The thought twisted my stomach. I had not only been betrayed by him, I had been used by all of them. I got off the bus near the river, the air colder here, damp and sharp. I walked toward the railing, the black water swirling beneath the faint glow of the lamps. The city was quiet here, removed from the noise and heat of the streets, and for the first time all night I allowed myself to breathe. My hands clutched the railing, the cold metal burning into my palms, and I let the anger spill out of me in ragged breaths. Years of sacrifice, years of being manipulated into believing I was building something real, all gone. My phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't him. It was my sister. Her name lit up the screen, and for a moment I hesitated. She didn't know. No one did. I had kept the illusion alive for so long, even from my own family. I had been too proud, too desperate to prove my marriage was strong, to admit the cracks. My throat tightened as I answered, her voice flooding the silence, warm and worried. "Where are you?" I heard something happened. I couldn't speak at first, the lump in my throat too heavy, but then the words poured out of me, raw and unfiltered. I told her everything, about the years, the mistress, the party, the truth of the child. My voice broke, but I didn't stop. There was silence on the other end when I finished, then a soft sigh. "Come here," she whispered. "You don't have to be alone tonight." And in that moment, I felt something shift. For so long, I had carried this burden alone, convinced that silence was strength. But maybe strength was something else entirely. Maybe it was admitting the pain, letting someone else carry a piece of it with me. The river roared beneath me, steady and endless. And for the first time that night, I felt the faint flicker of something I thought I had lost forever. Hope. I turned away from the railing, clutching my phone to my chest. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew I wasn't going back. Not to him, not to the lies. I would start again, no matter how broken I felt, no matter how many pieces I had to gather. Because if he had stolen my past, I refused to let him steal my future. The cab ride to my sister's apartment was silent except for the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, watching the city lights blur into streaks of gold and red, each one reminding me of the fire that still burned in my chest. My hands trembled in my lap, not from cold, but from the weight of everything that had just unraveled. I could feel the driver's curious glances in the rearview mirror, but I kept my eyes on the darkness outside. How could I begin to explain? How could anyone understand the years of sacrifice? The countless nights of swallowing my own pain just to keep a fragile dream alive? When we pulled up to her building, she was already waiting at the entrance. Her hair was pulled back hastily, her face pale with worry, and the moment I stepped out of the car, she wrapped her arms around me. The warmth of her embrace shattered whatever fragile composure I had left, and I broke down against her shoulder, sobs ripping through me as if I were being torn apart from the inside. She didn't say anything, just held me tighter, as though she knew words would only make the wounds sting more. Inside her apartment, the faint smell of coffee and laundry detergent filled the air. Familiar, comforting, safe. I sank into her couch, clutching a mug of tea she had placed in my hands, though I barely felt its warmth. My sister sat across from me, her eyes wide with shock as I recounted everything: the years of manipulation, the money I had funneled into his family, the mistress, the party, the revelation that had exploded like a grenade in the middle of his celebration. Her hands covered her mouth more than once, tears welling in her eyes. "You gave him everything," she whispered. "And he gave you this." Her words sliced through me because they were the truth I had been too afraid to face. I had given him everything. My youth, my money, my loyalty. I had bent myself into shapes I didn't recognize just to fit into the mold of the wife he wanted. And in return, I had been betrayed in the most public, humiliating way possible. I stared into the mug, my reflection trembling in the surface of the tea. "I don't even know who I am without him," I admitted, my voice barely audible. It was the first time I had spoken that thought aloud, the fear that had haunted me for years. Because somewhere along the way, I had stopped being myself. I had become an extension of him, his supporter, his provider, his excuse. Who was I now, stripped of that role? My sister reached across the table, taking my hand in hers. "You're stronger than you think," she said firmly. "You survived all of that. And you're still here." Her words settled deep inside me, not as comfort, but as a challenge. Was I really strong? Or was I just broken in ways that hadn't fully shown yet? As the night dragged on, exhaustion pulled at me, but my mind refused to rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face at that party, proud, smug, and then shattered when I spoke the truth. I saw the mistress's trembling hands on her stomach, the gasps of the guests, the cold stares of his family. It replayed over and over as though my mind refused to let me escape. I twisted beneath the blanket my sister had given me, my body trembling with the memories. At some point, I got up and walked to the small balcony, the night air biting at my skin. From up here, the city looked so calm, lights twinkling like nothing had happened. But I knew better. My world had been cracked wide open, the weight of it pressed on my chest. But underneath it all, something new began to stir. A question. Not of why he had done it. I already knew he was selfish, careless, incapable of love. No, the question that burned in me was what I was going to do next. Because tomorrow, the world would know. His family would spin their stories. He would beg, maybe even threaten. The mistress would cling to him, or leave him, depending on how much of her fantasy she was willing to let go of. But me? I had a choice I had never allowed myself before. I could disappear into silence again, let him twist the truth and paint me as bitter and cruel. Or I could rise from this wreckage, rebuild myself piece by piece, and never let him, or anyone, steal from me again. The thought both terrified and exhilarated me. For so long, my identity had been tied to him, to us. But now there was no us. There was only me. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to begin again. I wrapped the blanket tighter around my shoulders and stared out into the sleeping city. The night was long, the road ahead uncertain, but one thing was clear. I would never return to the cage he had built for me. I had broken it wide open, even if it left me bleeding. And as the first faint light of dawn began to stretch across the horizon, I felt it. Not peace, not yet, but resolve. The story was far from over, but this time I would be the one writing it. Morning light seeped through the thin curtains of my sister's apartment, painting the room in pale gold. I hadn't slept. My body had rested on the couch, but my mind had been a storm all night long, tossing me between memories of sacrifice and visions of the humiliation that had unfolded at that party. I sat up slowly, my muscles stiff, my throat raw from crying. The city outside was already awake. Horns blaring, people rushing to work. The normal rhythm of life continuing as if my world hadn't been shattered just hours before. My sister padded softly into the room, holding 2 mugs of coffee. She set one in front of me, her eyes tired but kind. "You need to eat something," she said gently, though I could see she didn't expect me to. I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting its warmth seep into my cold fingers. The bitter scent filled my nose, grounding me for a moment. My reflection stared back at me in the dark liquid. Swollen eyes, tangled hair, a face carved with exhaustion. I didn't look like a victim anymore. I looked like a survivor. But survival came with consequences. My phone buzzed on the table, its screen lighting up with messages. Dozens of them. His name, his mother's, even numbers I didn't recognize. I opened one without thinking, his words flashing across the screen, frantic and desperate. "Please, let's talk. You ruined everything, but we can fix this. Don't throw away what we have." My chest tightened, not with longing, but with anger. How dare he still call it we? How dare he beg for forgiveness while blaming me for the ruin he had created? Another message followed, this time from his mother. "You embarrassed us last night. Whatever problems you two have, it should have stayed between you. Family doesn't air its dirty laundry." My fingers trembled around the phone, fury rising like fire in my chest. Family? After everything I had given them, after years of putting their needs before my own, they dared to lecture me about loyalty? I wanted to scream, to throw the phone across the room, but instead I placed it face down on the table. I wouldn't let their voices dictate my decisions anymore. I thought about money then, the practical nightmare waiting for me. The joint accounts, the loans still in my name, the bills stacked on the kitchen counter of that house I couldn't bear to return to, the financial chains he had wrapped around me so tightly. For years I had believed we were building together, but in truth I had been carrying us both, dragging the weight of his lies while he wandered freely into the arms of another. The realization sickened me. I had not only lost my marriage, I had been robbed of my independence. But as heavy as it felt, another thought struck me with unexpected clarity. I had survived years of his manipulation, his absences, his betrayals. I had endured long nights at the hospital, 12-hour shifts, aching bones, and empty promises. If I could survive all of that, I could survive this too. My life didn't end with him. It began without him. My sister sat down beside me, her hand resting gently on mine. "You need to decide what comes next," she said softly. "Are you going back, or are you walking away for good?" The question hung in the air, heavy, final. I looked at her, tears stinging my eyes, and whispered the truth I had been afraid to admit even to myself. "There's nothing left to go back to." Her embrace was silent but steady, and for the first time in years, I felt safe, truly safe. Not the fragile illusion of safety I had clung to with him, but the real kind, the kind that came from honesty, from love without conditions or lies. My chest ached with both grief and relief, grief for the years I had lost, relief that I had finally cut the thread binding me to him. The day stretched ahead, uncertain and daunting. There would be papers to sign, accounts to untangle, painful conversations to endure, but there would also be freedom, the possibility of rediscovering myself, of reclaiming the woman I had been before his lies consumed me. I didn't know what that future looked like yet, but I knew I wanted to find out. As I sipped the bitter coffee, my eyes drifting toward the window, I thought of the party again, the decorations, the laughter, the way his face crumbled when I exposed him. I realized now that moment hadn't been just an ending. It had been a beginning. A brutal, messy, painful beginning, but a beginning nonetheless. And I wasn't going to waste it. I turned my phone over one last time, staring at his name on the screen. Then I pressed delete. His number, his messages, his hold over me, all gone in an instant. My hand trembled as I set the phone back down, but my chest felt lighter, as if I had finally cut the last rope tying me to a sinking ship. The road ahead was mine now. Terrifying, uncertain, but mine. The decision to delete his number should have felt small, but it was monumental. For years, my entire life had revolved around his calls, his texts, his excuses. I had been conditioned to jump at every buzz of my phone, to mold my emotions around whatever scraps of attention he decided to throw at me. And now, with one press of a button, that chain was broken. My hand trembled as if the phone itself were mourning the loss of control it no longer had over me. I stood from the couch, my legs weak but determined, and walked toward the small bathroom mirror. The reflection that stared back at me was a stranger. Puffy eyes, messy hair, skin pale from a sleepless night. Yet beneath the exhaustion, I saw something else, something I hadn't seen in years. A spark. Not of joy, not yet, but of defiance. The kind of fire that survives storms and refuses to go out. As I splashed cold water on my face, I thought of the years I had been manipulated into believing silence was strength. Every time I caught him in a lie, he had twisted it back onto me. You're imagining things. Don't be paranoid. Why would you even think that? Slowly, methodically, he had convinced me to doubt my own instincts, to silence my own voice. And I had let him. I had convinced myself that being a good wife meant enduring, forgiving, sacrificing. But as the water dripped down my cheeks, I whispered to the reflection, "No more." When I walked back into the living room, my sister was on the phone with someone. I heard her voice sharp and protective. She glanced at me, her brow furrowed, and mouthed, "It's him." I shook my head firmly. I didn't want to hear his voice. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of thinking he could still reach me. She hung up without hesitation, muttering under her breath about how he had no shame, calling after what he'd done. I sat down again, pulling the blanket around my shoulders. The warmth didn't reach the cold inside me, the emptiness carved by betrayal. My thoughts drifted to the future, to the mountain of tasks that awaited me. Lawyers, accounts, debts, papers I didn't know how to navigate. For a moment, fear clutched my chest. How would I survive this on my own? How would I rebuild from ashes when I had already given so much of myself away? But then I remembered the long nights at the hospital, the double shifts I had endured, the patients I had saved even when I was running on fumes. I remembered walking home in the freezing rain because I couldn't afford a cab, and still showing up the next morning with a smile. I had been strong before him, I realized, stronger than he ever deserved, and I could be strong again. My sister handed me a notebook and a pen. "Write it down," she said simply. "Make a list. Everything you need to do. Break it into pieces." I hesitated, then opened the notebook to a blank page. The pen felt heavy in my hand, but as soon as it touched the paper, the words poured out. Lawyer, bank, lock the accounts, collect my things, change the locks. Each line I wrote felt like reclaiming a piece of control. My handwriting wavered with emotion, but the page filled quickly, transforming chaos into something tangible. By the time I set the pen down, I felt lighter. Still broken, still raw, but lighter. The betrayal hadn't disappeared, but I had given myself something to hold on to, a plan. For the first time since the party, I felt like I was steering my life instead of being dragged behind it. I leaned back against the couch, closing my eyes. The image of his face appeared instantly. His panic, his desperation, the way his smile had crumbled when I exposed the truth. For years, he had been the center of my world. But now, he was just a man stripped of his mask, standing in the ruins of his own lies. And I realized something powerful. I didn't need him. I never had. As the day stretched on, sunlight pouring through the window, I felt a strange calmness settle over me. The pain was still there, sharp and relentless, but underneath it was a steady current of resolve. I would not go back. Not to him. Not to the life that had caged me. The door had closed, and though I was stepping into uncertainty, it was my uncertainty. My life, finally, was mine again. I opened my eyes and whispered to myself, as though carving the words into stone, "This is the beginning." The hours passed in a blur, but the silence of my sister's apartment gave me space to breathe. For the first time in years, there was no tension in the walls, no footsteps pacing back and forth while lies were rehearsed, no phone calls answered in hushed tones behind closed doors. Only quiet. And yet, the quiet was loud in its own way. It forced me to sit with my thoughts, to face the ghosts of my past that I had buried under years of sacrifice. By mid-afternoon, I decided I couldn't hide any longer. Not from the world, not from myself. I pulled out my phone, scrolling past the dozens of unanswered messages and missed calls until I found the one number I knew I needed to dial. A lawyer. I had written his name down that morning, my sister's recommendation, and though my hands shook as I pressed the digits, I forced myself to complete the call. Each ring on the other end felt like a test, like my courage might collapse before someone picked up. But then a calm voice answered, professional and steady, and I explained my situation in a rush. Marriage, betrayal, financial entanglements, humiliation. My words tumbled over each other, raw and desperate. But he didn't interrupt. When I finished, the silence on the line was heavy before he finally spoke. You have more power than you think. The law is on your side. Those words sank into me like an anchor in stormy seas. Power. I hadn't felt that in so long. For years I had been powerless, letting him dictate every decision, every narrative. But now, even if the road ahead was long, there was a system that could protect me, a way to untangle myself from his grip. After hanging up, I sat for a long time staring at the wall, the lawyer's words echoing in my head. Power. On my side. Slowly, I began to believe it. That belief was tested almost immediately. Another knock rattled the door. My sister opened it cautiously, and there he was. My husband, his face pale, his eyes red-rimmed as though he hadn't slept either. He tried to step inside, but my sister blocked him with a fury I had never seen in her. She doesn't want to see you, she snapped. He pleaded, his voice breaking. Please, just 5 minutes, let me explain. Explain. That word made me laugh bitterly from the couch. I stood, my legs trembling but firm, and walked into the doorway where he could see me. His eyes widened, filling with what looked like relief, as if my presence meant hope. But the only thing I felt was a cold clarity. There's nothing left to explain, I said, my voice steady. I know the truth. Everyone does. And I'm done. His face crumpled, desperation dripping from every line. You don't understand. I was scared. I made mistakes. But I love you. We can fix this. Don't throw everything away. His words were the same melody he had played for years, the same tune that had lulled me into silence. But now, the music no longer worked. It sounded hollow, pathetic, like a broken record refusing to accept it was useless. I shook my head. You threw it away. You destroyed it. And now you want me to pick up the pieces for you. Not this time. He reached out a hand, but my sister slammed the door shut between us. His muffled voice seeped through the wood, begging, pleading, swearing he would change. But the words slid off me like rain against glass. For the first time, I wasn't absorbing them. I wasn't carrying his guilt. I wasn't bending to his narrative. I simply turned away. The moment the lock clicked, my knees buckled, and I collapsed onto the couch. My sister rushed to my side, but I wasn't crying anymore. I was shaking, yes, my body quivering from the intensity of the confrontation, but tears wouldn't come. Instead, there was a hollow calmness inside me, as if my soul had finally severed the last invisible thread tying me to him. That night, as darkness fell again, I sat on the balcony staring at the city lights. My sister had gone to bed, leaving me alone with the sounds of traffic and distant voices rising from the streets below. I thought about the party again, about the moment I revealed the truth, about the silence that had followed. I realized that exposing him in front of everyone wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming myself, about making sure I was no longer invisible, no longer the quiet wife sacrificing in the shadows. The thought gave me a strange kind of peace. The road ahead would be long. Divorce papers, financial battles, rebuilding a life I had neglected for over a decade. But for the first time, the fear didn't paralyze me. It fueled me. Because now, every step I took would be mine. Mine alone. I wrapped the blanket tighter around me, the city air cool against my skin, and whispered to the night, I'm free. And for the first time in years, I believed it. The word free echoed in my chest long after I whispered it. as though saying it out loud had cracked something open inside me. Freedom was not a feeling I recognized easily. For more than a decade, I had lived in the prison of sacrifice, manipulation, and lies. I had built my days around his moods, his needs, his dreams. Now, sitting in my sister's balcony with the hum of the city below, I realized I had to learn how to breathe again without his shadow pressing on my lungs. The following morning, sunlight poured into the room like a challenge. It lit up the notebook I had filled with messy, desperate notes the day before. A plan. A list of things I needed to do. My sister was still asleep, but I couldn't stay still anymore. I picked up the notebook, my hands steady this time, and flipped through the pages. Every word I had written represented a chain I was ready to cut. Lawyer, bank, locks, accounts, belongings. My life was tangled with his in 1,000 small ways, but one by one, I would undo the knots. I made my first call at 9 sharp. The lawyer answered again, his voice calm, and we began the process of drafting the paperwork. Words like assets, division, and alimony filled the conversation. Words that once would have terrified me. Now they felt like tools, weapons even, placed into my hands after years of being defenseless. He explained that my sacrifices mattered, that the years I had carried him financially would not be ignored. For once, the law was not another enemy. It was a shield. When I hung up, my phone buzzed again with messages from him. I didn't open them. Not a single one. Instead, I scrolled to a new contact, my bank, and spent the next hour untangling accounts, freezing cards, protecting myself from the financial chaos I knew he would unleash. Every confirmation email that landed in my inbox felt like a small victory, proof that I was no longer just reacting to his lies. I was acting for myself. By midday, exhaustion hit me, but it was a different kind of exhaustion. Not the suffocating weariness of carrying someone else's burdens, but the satisfying ache of reclaiming control. I sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window, and for the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a tunnel with no light. It felt like a blank canvas. Terrifying, yes, but mine to paint. Still, the ghosts lingered. I thought of all the holidays I had spent alone while he worked late, of the times I had defended him when friends whispered their suspicions, of the moments I convinced myself that love meant enduring whatever came. I thought of the night I sat in the hospital cafeteria, exhausted from a 14-hour shift, only to check my phone and see pictures of him at a bar with friends, smiling, carefree, while I was barely holding myself together. And yet I forgave him. Again and again. The realization made my stomach twist. I wasn't just angry at him. I was angry at myself for how much I had allowed. But then another thought broke through the shame. I wasn't that woman anymore. The woman who silenced her doubts, who swallowed her voice, who gave everything without expecting respect in return. She had been destroyed at that party, yes. But in her place, someone new was being born. Someone harder, stronger, sharper. That evening, I went back to the park where he had once promised me the world. The same bench where I had sat the night I left the party, broken and lost. The swings still creaked in the wind, children's laughter floating through the air. Unaware of the stories these grounds carried for me, I sat down again, staring at the horizon painted in orange and pink, and whispered to myself, never again. The words weren't just a vow. They were a shield. A declaration to the universe that I would never allow myself to be buried under someone else's lies again. For the first time, the memory of him didn't bring me to tears. It didn't choke me or make me feel small. It simply reminded me of what I had survived. And survival, I realized, was no small thing. I walked away from the park as the sun dipped below the skyline, my steps steady, my chest lighter. The future was uncertain, but one truth was carved deep into me now. I wasn't defined by the betrayal or the party or the whispers of his family. I was defined by my choice to stand, to walk away, to begin again. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The days that followed felt like walking through ashes. Every morning I woke up in my sister's apartment with the same heaviness pressing on my chest. But each day I forced myself to take one more step forward, One more call, one more document signed, one more knot untangled from the life I had once shared with him. It wasn't easy. Freedom never is. It demands not only courage, but the will to endure the weight of consequences. His family didn't stay silent. The messages kept coming, not just from him, but from his mother, his cousins, even old friends who thought they had the right to lecture me. They told me I had overreacted, that I should have stayed quiet, that family problems shouldn't be displayed in front of strangers, as if his betrayal had been a private affair, as if my humiliation had been mine alone to carry. Each message stung, reopening wounds I was desperate to close, but I refused to answer. Silence became my new weapon. At night, though, when the apartment grew still and the city outside hummed with life, I found myself replaying everything in my head: the party, the gasps, the look in his eyes when I revealed the truth. It came back in sharp flashes, as if my mind refused to let me forget. Sometimes the memories made me tremble with rage. Other times they crushed me with grief. I would sit on the balcony, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the indifferent stars, and wonder how I had given so much to someone who valued me so little. And then I would think of the years, the endless sacrifices, the double shifts, the sleepless nights, the money wired to his parents, the loans I took in my name, the dreams I placed on a shelf to collect dust. For what? For a man who smiled into the arms of another woman while I broke my body to keep us afloat. The bitterness was sharp, but hidden beneath it was something stronger, a kind of awakening, a realization that the woman who endured all of that wasn't weak, she was resilient. And now that same resilience was mine to use for myself. One evening, my sister convinced me to step outside with her, to breathe something other than the stale air of heartbreak. We walked through the market streets, the smell of roasted corn and fried dough hanging in the air. For a while, I forgot the weight pressing on my chest. I saw mothers laughing with their children, couples holding hands, vendors shouting their prices. Life was moving forward, even if mine felt frozen. And in that moment, I realized something simple yet profound. The world hadn't ended. My world had changed, yes, but life went on, and so would I. When we returned, there was a letter waiting at the door. His handwriting, familiar and unwanted, scrawled across the envelope. My hands shook as I picked it up, debating whether to tear it apart unread. Curiosity won. Inside, his words spilled across the page in rushed ink. Apologies, excuses, declarations of love. He begged me to remember our early years, the trips we took, the laughter we shared. He wrote that the baby could still be ours if I forgave him, that we could raise it together, that mistakes didn't erase love. I sat at the table reading his desperate plea, my chest tightening. Once those words might have broken me. Once I might have believed them. But now all I saw was manipulation dressed as romance, desperation disguised as devotion. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking for survival, for me to patch the holes in the ship he had sunk. I folded the letter neatly and slid it into the trash without a word. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Because letting go isn't a single act. It's a choice made over and over again. And with each choice, I felt stronger. I was learning to build a life where my worth wasn't tied to someone else's lies. A life where my sacrifices wouldn't be wasted. A life that, for the first time, belonged entirely to me. And as the moonlight spilled across the balcony, I whispered again to myself, I'm free. This time, the word didn't just echo. It stayed. The final step came faster than I expected. A week later, I found myself sitting in a lawyer's office, the hum of the air conditioner filling the silence as papers were laid out in front of me. Divorce, settlement, division of assets. Words that once would have made me tremble now felt like weapons I was finally allowed to wield. My hand shook slightly as I signed, not from doubt, but from the weight of closing a chapter that had defined more than a decade of my life. Each signature felt like carving away a piece of the cage he had built around me. By the time I set the pen down, I was no longer his wife. I was me again. Walking out of that office, the city seemed brighter, though nothing had really changed. Cars honked. People hurried across streets. The The same chaos of life swirled around me. But inside, everything was different. I wasn't tethered to his lies anymore. The invisible chains of his manipulation, the suffocating silence I had endured, the years of sacrifice, all of it had been severed. I stood at the edge of the sidewalk, the sun warming my face, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Of course, there were scars. Nights when memories crept back in, uninvited, dragging with them the sound of laughter from that party, the look in his eyes when I exposed him, the whispers of people who had once praised me but now judged me. Sometimes the pain hit me so hard I had to sit down, clutching my chest as if betrayal could still pierce me even after everything was over. But then, I would remember the woman I had become, the one who stood up, who walked out, who reclaimed her life, and the pain would pass. My sister often asked me if I regretted exposing him in front of everyone. She worried that it had left me too raw, too humiliated, but I always shook my head. If I had stayed silent, I told her, they would still see me as the devoted wife, and him as the man who could do no wrong. The truth had to come out. Not just for them, for me. And I meant it. That moment of revelation, brutal and public as it was, had been the turning point of my life. It was the moment I chose myself over his lies. Weeks later, I returned to the park one last time. The bench where he once promised me the world was empty, waiting, as if it had been holding my story all along. I sat down, the evening breeze brushing against my face, and I thought about the woman who had once sat here believing every word he said. I grieved for her, the innocence, the loyalty, the dreams she buried. But I also honored her, because without her endurance, I wouldn't have survived long enough to be here now. Children laughed in the distance, the sound pure and untangled from deceit. Couples strolled by, their hands intertwined, their futures unwritten. And for the first time, I didn't envy them. I didn't crave what they had. Instead, I felt a strange gratitude for the emptiness beside me on that bench, because it meant space. Space to rebuild, space to rediscover, space to finally live for myself. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The air was crisp, clean, untainted by lies. And in that breath, I felt it fully for the first time. Not just the echo of the word, not just the idea whispered in the night, but the reality of it. Freedom. It wasn't the kind of freedom that comes without scars, without pain, without loss. It was messy, hard-earned, and heavy with memories. But it was mine. And with it came the power to shape a future that belonged only to me. I stood from the bench, brushed the dust from my coat, and walked away. Not from him, not from the past, but toward myself. And that was the truest liberation of all.